The United States and the Industrial Society had a massive immigration population. In fact, it is estimated in 1914 that 21 million out of the 92 million total living in the United States were immigrants. Many of these immigrants settled in major cities were separated by ethnicity, each having their own institutions such as churches, political machines, and newspapers. For instance, immigrants found themselves very involved in political processes, often relying on protections offered by political machines. However, life for these immigrants was extremely difficult as many of them lived in undesirable conditions such as crowded apartments subject to fire hazards. Immigrants were often subject to unsafe working conditions, very long workweek hours with little pay. In fact, not even half of workers could survive on one paycheck. During this time period, social conditions were very insecure as there were few procedures in place to protect people against issues such as poverty, discrimination, crimes, and fire. Social reform during this era at first seemed unlikely due to political machines and corrupt politicians. However, public opinion on industrialization began to shift when Americans became aware of the power of corporations, specifically stories about unsafe medicine and defective products that prompted Americans to want regulations to be put in place. An increased attention to the environment was key for the reform movement. Perhaps the landmarks for the progressive reforms were regulations executed nearly all at the local and state government and then some at the federal level. Regulations are crucial because they authorize not only standards for entities such as corporations, restaurants, and employers, but also punish those who break them through fines, taking away licenses, or even jail time. However, this was not done easily and required countless political wars among reform organizations. One of the social reforms enacted was for mothers' pensions. However, the disheartening reality is that very few actually benefited due to residency and citizenship requirements, long waits, and rejection of applications because of poor health. Despite this setback, progressives did succeed in establishing juvenile courts. This allowed for children under 14 to be tried in these special courts rather than adult courts. Juvenile courts allowed for factors such as family situations and options such as probation to be examined. The progressives also had success in establishing the National Children's Bureau. Despite its very small budget, the Bureau succeeded in taking actions such as setting up clinics for pregnant women and children and made significant strides in limiting child labor. By 1920, nearly all states had adopted workers' compensation laws. If somebody got injured on the job, workers gave up their right to sue the employer and were instead entitled to an amount of money determined by the injury. During this progressive era, there were some successes for women. For instance, by 1916, 12 states had given women the right to vote. In addition, the number of women in the employment setting, although still restricted by protective labor laws, increased. However, women were still largely oppressed in regards to their sexual freedom and were still expected to live a life of domesticity. Other oppressed groups at the time include African American, Asian immigrants, and Spanish-speaking persons. Something important to note during the progressive era were the racist immigration policies in place. For instance, white immigrants faced far less barriers such as annual limits, literacy tests, and were allowed to naturalize after 5 years. However, the Immigration Restriction League created ways to restrict immigration through literacy tests. By 1920, the profession of social work came to rise. Many social workers of this era were out to seek the regulation of instances such as child labor and women's working conditions. Many social workers support reforms such as eliminating patronage and corruption from institutions and poorhouses. Overall, progressives helped the development of the modern welfare state by encouraging the government to intervene in social issues, but this was mostly done at state and local levels. However, it is important to address that although progressives increased social obligations, they were often highly discriminatory towards immigrants and African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans. Something that can be learned from the progressive movement is the mistakes they made. For instance, the progressives failed to expand the movement to the federal government. Some issues, such as poverty and unemployment, need federal aid for them to be examined sufficiently.